In the winter of 1952, a radio operator named James Holloway sat alone in a concrete bunker 17 miles south of the Yalu River, his fingers hovering over a transmitter that had been silent for 3 days. The snow outside had begun to cover the antenna array, muffling the world into a kind of white static that matched the hiss coming through his headset. He was 22 years old, thin from rationing, and had stopped sleeping properly sometime around Thanksgiving. His orders were simple: maintain communication with forward observation posts, relay coordinates, and under no circumstances attempt to contact units listed as missing in action. But on the night of December 8th at exactly 0230 hours, his radio crackled to life with a voice he recognized, calling from a position that had been overrun 11 days earlier. The voice belonged to Sergeant Daniel Cross, and it was asking for artillery support. What happened next would become one of the most classified incidents of the Korean War, buried so deep in military archives that even its existence was considered a breach of operational security. This is not a story about ghosts, though many who heard the recordings would later claim it felt that way. This is a story about frequency, about the human mind under extreme duress, and about what happens when the line between memory and transmission becomes so thin that soldiers begin to answer voices that should not exist. This is the story of Operation Silent Echo, a psychological warfare experiment that turned grief into a weapon, and in doing so discovered something far more disturbing than anyone had intended. The Korean Peninsula in late 1952 was a landscape of frozen trenches and grinding attrition, where the war had settled into a brutal stalemate that consumed men without moving borders. By winter, the conflict had transformed from rapid advances and desperate retreats into something darker and more psychological, a war of nerves fought across ridgelines and listening posts where the real enemy was often the cold, the isolation, and the knowledge that every day brought the same exhausting terror. The United States military, locked in this frozen hell, had begun experimenting with new forms of warfare, methods that targeted not the body but the mind, seeking advantages in morale disruption and psychological pressure that conventional weapons could not provide. Radio had always been a tool of war, but by 1952 it had evolved into something more sophisticated than simple communication. The Psychological Warfare Division, operating out of unmarked facilities in Tokyo and later Busan, had been studying the effects of sound, suggestion, and repetition on combat effectiveness since the closing months of World War II. They understood that a voice in the dark could be as devastating as artillery, that the right message delivered at the right frequency could break a soldier faster than bullets. They knew that men in combat were particularly vulnerable to auditory manipulation because their brains were already operating in a state of heightened stress, where pattern recognition became hyperactive and the distinction between real threat and phantom menace began to blur. The concept was elegant in its cruelty. If you could make an enemy soldier doubt what he was hearing, doubt his own perceptions, doubt whether his comrades were still alive or already dead, you could induce a kind of paralysis that no amount of training could overcome. Early experiments focused on broadcasting false orders on enemy frequencies, creating phantom radio traffic designed to confuse and demoralize. These tests produced mixed results. Enemy forces quickly adapted, developing verification protocols and code systems that rendered simple deception ineffective. But the research teams noticed something unexpected in their data, something that would lead them toward Operation Silent Echo and its terrible revelation. They noticed that soldiers responded far more intensely to voices they recognized than to anonymous commands. A man could dismiss a stranger's voice as enemy propaganda, but when he heard his friend, his sergeant, his brother speaking from a position he knew was destroyed, something deeper happened. His training fell away. His rational mind struggled against what his emotions insisted was real. And in that moment of cognitive dissonance, in that fracture between what he knew and what he felt, he became vulnerable in ways that transcended ordinary fear. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the architect of Operation Silent Echo, was a behavioral psychologist who had spent the war years studying prisoner interrogation techniques and the effects of sensory deprivation on captured airmen. He was 41 years old, Harvard-educated, and possessed the kind of clinical detachment that allowed him to view human suffering as data rather than tragedy. His personnel file described him as brilliant and thorough, but those who worked directly under him used different words: obsessive, remote, and occasionally unsettling in his ability to discuss psychological torture with the same tone one might use to describe crop rotation. He believed, with the certainty of a man who had never experienced combat himself, that the next war would be won not through superior firepower but through superior manipulation of the human nervous system. Webb's proposal, submitted to the Psychological Warfare Division in September of 1952, outlined a program designed to exploit what he called residual auditory bonding among combat units. His theory was straightforward. Soldiers in prolonged combat situations developed deep psychological connections to the voices of their unit members, connections so powerful that they could override rational assessment of danger. These bonds were strengthened by stress, by shared survival, and by the simple fact that in combat a familiar voice often meant the difference between life and death. Webb proposed that by recording and rebroadcasting these voices, particularly voices of soldiers known to be dead or missing, psychological warfare units could create a form of auditory haunting that would devastate enemy morale. The ethical concerns were raised immediately and dismissed just as quickly. This was war, and war had never been concerned with the comfort of those who fought it. The question was not whether the technique was humane but whether it would work, whether it could be implemented effectively in field conditions, and whether the psychological impact would be sufficient to justify the resources required. Webb argued that it would, that the technique represented a fundamental evolution in psychological warfare because it weaponized grief itself, turning the natural human response to loss into a vector for confusion and despair. His superiors, men hardened by 3 years of frozen hills and mounting casualties, approved a limited field trial. The target was not enemy forces, not initially. Webb insisted that before deploying the technique against North Korean or Chinese units, they needed to understand exactly how it worked, what dosage of exposure produced what level of effect, and how to maximize psychological damage while maintaining operational security. They needed a controlled environment, a test population that could be monitored closely, and circumstances that would allow for precise measurement of results. They needed, in other words, to test it on their own soldiers first. This decision, made in a windowless office in Tokyo on October 14, would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives, though not all of them would live long enough for that haunting to matter. The test site selected was Forward Operating Post 19, a small observation bunker complex located in the Central Highlands, isolated enough for security but close enough to active combat zones to ensure the subjects were under genuine stress. The unit stationed there consisted of 12 men, 1 lieutenant, 2 sergeants, and 9 enlisted personnel responsible for monitoring enemy movement and calling in fire missions. They were, by all accounts, a competent and stable unit, men who had been fighting together since the spring and had developed the kind of tight cohesion that made them ideal subjects for Webb's experiment. None of them knew they had been selected. None of them would be told, not before and not after, though after would prove to be a relative term for most of them. On November 27, Forward Operating Post 19 was attacked by a Chinese probe force estimated at company strength. The engagement lasted 4 hours, ending when American artillery finally broke up the assault after the forward observers had called fire practically on top of their own position. When reinforcements arrived the following morning, they found the bunker complex destroyed, the radio equipment smashed, and 7 members of the unit dead. The 5 survivors, badly wounded and in shock, were evacuated to a field hospital and then rotated back to a rear area for recovery. This was recorded as a straightforward tactical loss, tragic but unremarkable in the context of a war that produced such losses daily. What was not recorded in the official reports was that the attack had been allowed to happen. Intelligence had identified the Chinese probe force 6 hours before it reached Post 19, plenty of time to reinforce the position or evacuate the personnel. Instead, orders came down from division headquarters to maintain radio silence and allow the situation to develop naturally. The official explanation, delivered months later during a closed investigation, was that division had wanted to preserve the integrity of a larger operation in the sector and could not risk alerting enemy forces to American awareness of their movements. But the men who issued those orders and the men who filed the reports, and the men who later destroyed most of the relevant documentation, all knew the truth. Post 19 had been sacrificed deliberately, offered up as part of Webb's experiment because Operation Silent Echo required casualties, required voices that could be harvested and redeployed, required the raw material of grief. The recordings were made in the 3 weeks leading up to the attack. Radio communications from Post 19 were monitored continuously, every transmission archived and catalogued, with special attention paid to voices, speech patterns, and the casual exchanges that characterized routine military traffic. Webb's team collected hours of material, sergeants calling in coordinates, soldiers joking during quiet watches, officers delivering briefings and discussing tactical situations. They documented the acoustic signature of each man's voice, the regional accents, the verbal tics and idiosyncrasies that made each individual recognizable to his comrades. They built, in essence, a library of ghosts, audio profiles that could be extracted and manipulated and broadcast back across frequencies that survivors would be monitoring. James Holloway, the radio operator who would become the focal point of the experiment's next phase, was one of the 5 survivors evacuated from Post 19. He had been 20 feet from the main bunker when it took a direct hit from a Chinese grenade, far enough to avoid fatal wounds but close enough to be buried under collapsing sandbags and freezing soil. He spent 3 hours trapped in darkness, listening to the battle end and silence take over, before engineers dug him out with bleeding hands and faces tight with the kind of exhaustion that comes from pulling dead friends from rubble. His physical injuries were manageable. A fractured collarbone, lacerations, mild frostbite on both feet. His psychological state was less clear, though the field hospital notes described him as withdrawn, uncommunicative, and experiencing auditory hallucinations consistent with acute combat stress. By December 3, Holloway had been assigned to a rear area signals unit operating from a bunker complex near the Imjin River, a relatively quiet sector where his duties involved maintaining communication equipment and monitoring routine traffic. The assignment was presented as light duty, a chance to recover before being rotated home or reassigned to a combat unit. In reality, it was a carefully constructed cage. The bunker had been modified with recording equipment hidden in the walls, his radio console had been wired to allow external signal injection, and the isolation of the position ensured that he would have no immediate contact with other personnel who might interrupt the experiment. He was, without knowing it, a laboratory subject and the test was about to begin. The first transmission occurred on December 8, as described, at 0230 hours. Holloway was alone, running routine checks on communication circuits, when his headset filled with static and then resolved into a voice he knew better than his own brothers. Sergeant Daniel Cross had been the senior NCO at Post 19, a career soldier from West Virginia who spoke with a mountain accent and had a habit of ending every transmission with the phrase, "standing by." He had died in the initial assault, killed instantly when the bunker command post collapsed, and Holloway had helped carry what was left of him to the evacuation point 3 days later. Now his voice was requesting artillery support for a position that no longer existed, using call signs that had been retired, speaking with the calm professionalism of a man who had no idea he was dead. Holloway's first response was silence, the kind of paralyzed silence that comes when the mind encounters something it cannot process. Then he keyed his microphone and answered, his voice shaking, asking for confirmation of position and status. The transmission repeated, exact same words, exact same pacing, and Holloway realized he was hearing a recording, had to be hearing a recording, except the voice was too perfect, too precisely cross in every detail, down to the slight roughness in the consonants that came from years of smoking unfiltered cigarettes. He tried other frequencies, attempting to raise anyone else on the net, but found only static or distant chatter from units too far away to matter. When he returned to the original frequency, Cross was still there, still asking for support, still waiting for a response that Holloway could not give because the coordinates referenced a hillside that was now held by enemy forces, and supporting it would mean calling fire on Chinese positions using ammunition that would never come. The transmission lasted 7 minutes before fading into static. Holloway sat motionless for over an hour afterward, staring at the radio console, waiting for the voice to return. When it didn't, he filed a routine report noting a possible equipment malfunction and then sat through the rest of his watch in a state of numb awareness, unsure if he had experienced a technical glitch, a psychological episode, or something else entirely. He did not mention hearing Cross specifically, did not include that detail in his report, because writing it down would make it real in a way he could not yet accept. Instead, he told himself it had been interference, cross-chatter from another unit, his exhausted mind filling in familiar patterns where none existed. But the voice came back. It came back the following night at the same time, and the night after that, and soon Holloway was waiting for it, anticipating the exact moment when the static would clear and Cross would speak. The transmissions varied slightly. Sometimes Cross was requesting fire support, sometimes reporting enemy movement, sometimes simply checking in with a routine status update. But the voice was always the same, always exact, and always ended with that signature phrase, "Standing by." Holloway began responding, carrying on conversations with a dead man, providing map coordinates that meant nothing and tactical updates for a position that existed only in memory. He knew, on some rational level, that he was speaking to a recording, but the knowing did not help because his emotional response was stronger than his logic, and every time he heard Cross's voice his body reacted as if his sergeant were still alive, still in danger, still waiting for support that Holloway had failed to provide. What Holloway did not know, could not know, was that his every word was being recorded and analyzed by Webb's research team. They monitored his voice stress levels, tracked changes in his response patterns, noted when he became more engaged with the phantom transmission and when he attempted to rationalize it away. They documented his sleep deprivation, his declining food intake, his increasing isolation from the other personnel in his unit. They watched, in essence, as he began to unravel, as the repeated exposure to Cross's voice eroded his ability to distinguish between past and present, between memory and reality, between the living and the dead. And they considered this data, this careful documentation of one man's psychological disintegration, to be a success. By the end of the second week, Holloway was spending his off-duty hours in the bunker, monitoring frequencies that should have been empty, listening for voices that should not exist. Other members of his unit noticed the change, commented on his withdrawal and his tendency to stare at the radio equipment with an intensity that made them uncomfortable, but in a war zone where everyone carried their own private damage, his behavior did not trigger formal intervention. He was still functional, still completing his duties, and if he seemed haunted, that was hardly unusual for someone who had survived an overrun position. His commanding officer noted his deteriorating state in a weekly report but took no action, in part because the orders from higher headquarters explicitly stated that Holloway was to be left undisturbed unless his behavior posed an immediate operational risk. Those orders had come from Webb's office, routed through channels that obscured their origin, and they represented a level of institutional callousness that even veterans of the Psychological Warfare Division found disturbing. Webb was not merely studying Holloway's response to auditory trauma. He was cultivating it, deliberately intensifying the exposure to ensure maximum psychological impact. The research team began introducing new variables. They added other voices from Post-19, short transmissions from soldiers Holloway had known, creating a network of phantom communications that suggested the destroyed unit was somehow still operational, still fighting, still waiting for relief. They varied the timing of the transmissions, making them unpredictable, so that Holloway could never be certain when he might hear his dead friends speaking. They even, in what would later be considered the experiment's most grotesque element, began having the voices reference Holloway by name, speaking directly to him, asking why he had not responded faster, why he had not called for help, why he had survived when they had not. The psychological mechanism at work was well understood, even in 1952. Combat survivors frequently experienced guilt over their survival, a sense of having failed their dead comrades that could persist for decades. Webb's technique amplified this natural response by giving it a voice, by transforming abstract guilt into concrete accusation. Instead of wrestling with his own internal doubts, Holloway was confronted with external confirmation of his failures, delivered in the voices of the men he felt he had abandoned. The effect was devastating. Within 3 weeks of the transmission's beginning, Holloway had developed what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, characterized by hypervigilance, dissociation, and an inability to distinguish between traumatic memory and present reality. But Webb wanted more. He wanted to know if the technique could induce not just psychological distress but actual behavioral change, if a soldier could be manipulated through auditory trauma into taking actions he would not otherwise consider. On December 29, the transmissions changed. Cross's voice, which had been requesting artillery support for 3 weeks, suddenly began giving Holloway orders: gather intelligence on friendly positions, document security procedures, prepare detailed maps of the defensive network. The instructions were delivered in the same calm, professional tone Cross had used in life, framed as routine requests from a forward observer who needed updated information. Anne Holloway, by this point so deeply immersed in the fiction of post-19 survival that reality had become negotiable, began to comply. He started compiling the information Cross requested, working late into the night, documenting troop movements and communication protocols and defensive positions with the thoroughness of a man who believed he was helping his unit. He did not question why Cross would need this information, did not ask himself why a forward observation post would be requesting details about rear area security. His mind, fragmented by stress and manipulation, had accepted the basic premise that Post-19 was still operational and that his duty was to support it. The fact that this support involved gathering intelligence that would be catastrophic in enemy hands never occurred to him, or if it did, the thought was overridden by the deeper need to answer the voices that called to him every night. Webb's team monitored this development with clinical interest. They had successfully demonstrated that auditory manipulation could not only induce psychological trauma but could also be used to direct behavior, potentially turning a loyal soldier into an unwitting intelligence asset. The implications were staggering. If the technique could make Holloway betray operational security to a phantom radio transmission, it could presumably be used to make enemy soldiers do the same, to extract information without interrogation, to turn men into agents of their own side's destruction simply by speaking to them in the voices of their dead. It was, in Webb's assessment, the perfect weapon for a new kind of warfare, one where battles would be won not on frozen hills but in the contested space of human consciousness. But something went wrong. Something that Webb's research had not accounted for, that his theories of auditory manipulation and psychological pressure had not predicted. Holloway began to change in ways that exceeded the expected parameters of trauma response. He started speaking differently, adopting Cross's mountain accent and verbal patterns, ending his own transmissions with "standing by," even when communicating with living personnel. He would sometimes refer to himself in the third person, using Cross's name, as if the boundary between his own identity and the recorded voice had begun to dissolve. Other personnel in his unit reported hearing him having conversations in the bunker when he was alone, speaking both parts of a dialogue in different voices, acting out exchanges with people who were not there. The research team noted these developments with growing concern. This was not simple psychological breakdown. This was something closer to dissociative identity disorder, a fragmentation of self that suggested the auditory manipulation had damaged Holloway's psyche in ways that went beyond stress response. Webb argued that these were simply extreme data points, valuable precisely because they revealed the outer limits of the technique's power, but others on the team began to question whether the experiment had crossed a line from research into something closer to torture. The debate became heated, with several members requesting to be removed from the project. And by early January there was serious discussion about terminating Operation Silent Echo and providing Holloway with psychiatric treatment. That discussion ended on January 7, when Holloway disappeared. He was reported missing during a routine check when he failed to respond to radio calls and was found absent from his post. A search of the bunker revealed that he had taken his personal weapon, a field jacket, and a portable radio transceiver. He had left behind his identification, his personal effects, and a handwritten note that consisted of a single sentence: "Going to bring them back." The search teams found his tracks in the snow leading north, toward the front lines, toward the sector where Post-19 had been destroyed. He was moving deliberately, following a route that would take him directly through the neutral zone and into territory controlled by Chinese forces. The recovery effort was immediate but complicated by the fact that Holloway's disappearance could not be explained in official channels. He could not be reported as having suffered a psychological break due to an unauthorized experiment, could not be listed as having been manipulated into desertion by his own command. Instead, the narrative became that he had experienced combat stress and wandered away from his post, a tragic but understandable consequence of war. Search teams were dispatched with orders to find him quickly and quietly, to bring him back before he reached enemy lines or, if that proved impossible, to ensure he did not survive to be captured. The unspoken instruction, never committed to paper, was that Holloway had become a security risk, and security risks in a war zone had a way of being resolved with finality. They found him 3 days later, or what was left of him, in a collapsed bunker that matched the location of forward operating Post 19. He had been dead for at least 12 hours, killed by exposure and exhaustion, curled into a corner of the ruined structure with the portable radio clutched against his chest. The radio was still on, still set to the frequency where Cross's voice had spoken, still hissing with empty static. His face, according to the recovery team's report, bore an expression of peace, as if he had finally found what he was searching for. The note found in his jacket pocket, written in a shaking hand, read, "Make contact. They're waiting. Will maintain position. Standing by." The official cause of death was listed as hypothermia complicated by combat stress. No mention was made of Operation Silent Echo, no connection drawn between his death and the experiment that had destroyed him. His body was returned to his family with full military honors, and the incident was buried in files that would remain classified for the next 40 years. Webb's research team was quietly dispersed, reassigned to different projects and different theaters, with orders to never discuss what they had witnessed. The equipment used in the experiment was destroyed, the recordings were erased, and the program itself was officially terminated on January 15, 1953, noted in documents as having been unsuccessful due to technical limitations. But that was not the end. That was never going to be the end, because the frequency that had spoken to James Holloway did not stop transmitting when the experiment ended. Throughout January and into February, radio operators across the sector began reporting anomalous transmissions on the channel that had been used for Operation Silent Echo, voices calling for artillery support, voices requesting backup, voices that spoke with the calm professionalism of soldiers who did not know they were dead. The transmissions came at irregular intervals, always at night, always brief, and always disturbing enough that operators would file reports and then try to forget what they had heard. Technical teams investigated, searching for the source of the phantom broadcasts, but found nothing. The transmitters used in Webb's experiment had been dismantled and destroyed, the recording equipment removed, the entire operational infrastructure eliminated. Yet the voices persisted, growing more frequent as the winter deepened, spreading to frequencies beyond the original test channel, contaminating radio nets across multiple divisions until some units stopped monitoring certain bands altogether because the phantom traffic had become too disruptive to operational communication. The explanations offered were technical: atmospheric conditions, equipment malfunction, interference from enemy broadcasting stations attempting psychological warfare of their own. But the radio operators who heard the transmissions knew better, knew that what they were hearing was not simple interference but something specific, something personal, voices that spoke with the authority of men who had died in those frozen hills and somehow could not stop calling for help. Some operators began responding to the phantom transmissions, engaging in brief exchanges before realizing what they were doing and falling silent with expressions of deep unease. Others simply logged the incidents and said nothing, adding another layer of unreported strangeness to a war that had already exceeded everyone's capacity for horror. By March, the phenomenon had spread beyond the Korean peninsula. Radio operators in Japan and Okinawa, even on ships patrolling the Sea of Japan, began reporting similar experiences. Familiar voices on empty frequencies, call signs from destroyed units, messages that reference battles and positions from months or years earlier. The pattern was always the same: a burst of static, a voice calling with calm urgency, a request for support or information, and then silence. The transmissions never lasted more than a few minutes, never provided enough information to be tactically useful or operationally dangerous, but they were consistent enough that the Psychological Warfare Division opened a new investigation, codenamed Project Silent Echo Echo, to determine whether enemy forces had somehow captured Webb's research and were deploying it against American troops. The investigation concluded that no such capture had occurred, that the communist forces lacked both the technical sophistication and the specific intelligence necessary to replicate the experiment. This should have been reassuring confirmation that the phantom transmissions were merely a combination of equipment quirks and psychological projection by stressed personnel. Instead, it raised a question that no one wanted to answer. If the enemy was not broadcasting these messages, and if American equipment was not creating them, then what was their source? Where were these voices coming from, and why did they sound so precisely like the dead? Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, by this time reassigned to a research facility in Virginia, was consulted by the investigation team. His response, preserved in a classified memo dated April 3, 1953, demonstrated a chilling combination of scientific curiosity and complete lack of remorse. He suggested that the phantom transmissions might represent a form of psychoacoustic imprinting, where the original broadcast had created resonance patterns in the equipment itself, patterns that could theoretically persist and even replicate under certain atmospheric and electromagnetic conditions. It was, he acknowledged, an unlikely explanation, one that bordered on the supernatural, but it was the only hypothesis that fit the observed data. He concluded the memo by requesting permission to establish a new research program to study the phenomenon, proposing that if the transmissions were genuine residual effects, they represented a breakthrough in psychological warfare that should be explored rather than suppressed. Permission was denied. Webb's request was not merely rejected but specifically flagged as demonstrating concerning judgment and a lack of understanding regarding the program's ethical implications. He was removed from all psychological warfare research, transferred to administrative duties, and quietly monitored for the remainder of his military career. He retired in 1956, accepted a teaching position at a small college in Pennsylvania, and died of a heart attack in 1963, taking whatever understanding he had developed about Operation Silent Echo to a grave that was notable only for its lack of visitors. The phantom transmissions continued throughout the remainder of the Korean War, tapering off after the armistice but never completely disappearing. Scattered reports continued through the 1950s and into the 1960s, usually from veterans who had served in Korea and later found themselves hearing familiar voices on shortwave radios or civilian communication bands. These reports were rarely official, mostly consisting of letters to veterans organizations or statements made during psychiatric evaluations, and they were universally dismissed as symptoms of post-traumatic stress or the natural tendency of the human mind to find patterns in random noise. No serious investigation was conducted, no attempt made to correlate the experiences or determine if there was any empirical basis for the claims. The voices became folklore, war stories told late at night in VFW halls, the kind of tales that everyone had heard but nobody quite believed. But in 1982, during a routine review of declassified Korean War materials, a Defense Department archivist named Sarah Chin discovered a cache of documents related to Operation Silent Echo that had been misfiled and overlooked during the original classification purge. The materials included Webb's research notes, audio recordings that should have been destroyed, and detailed logs of Holloway's interactions with the Phantom transmissions. Chin, recognizing the historical significance, brought the discovery to her superiors, expecting that the documents would be properly archived and eventually released to researchers studying psychological warfare programs. Instead, within 48 hours of her report, the materials were reclassified at the highest level. Chin was removed from the project, and the entire cache was transferred to a facility that specialized in what the military termed sensitive historical artifacts. The official explanation given to Chin was that the materials contained information that could compromise ongoing intelligence operations, a standard justification that was used whenever the government wanted to bury something uncomfortable. But Chin, who had worked with classified materials for over a decade, knew the difference between legitimate security concerns and institutional embarrassment. She recognized that Operation Silent Echo represented not a threat to current operations but a revelation about how far the military had been willing to go in experimenting on its own personnel, and that revelation was precisely what made the materials dangerous. Not dangerous to national security, but dangerous to the mythology of honor and care that the military maintained about its treatment of soldiers. She was right, of course, but being right did not protect her career. Chin was transferred to a different department, her security clearance was reduced, and her attempts to discuss the discovery with colleagues or journalists were met with legal threats that made clear she would face prosecution if she revealed anything about what she had found. She eventually left government service, wrote no memoirs, gave no interviews, and died in 2003 without ever publicly discussing Operation Silent Echo. But before she left the archives, before the documents were sealed and her access revoked, she made copies, careful handwritten notes that she kept in a safety deposit box with instructions that they be released only after her death. Those notes, finally made public in 2005, provided the first concrete evidence that Operation Silent Echo had existed and that James Holloway had been one of its victims. The revelations caused a brief controversy, a few news articles, some calls for investigation, but the story never gained significant traction. It was competing with more immediate scandals, more current wars, and the public's attention had always struggled with horrors that occurred decades in the past. The military issued a statement acknowledging that psychological warfare experiments had been conducted during the Korean War, that some of those experiments had involved questionable ethical practices, and that the Department of Defense deeply regretted any harm caused to service members. No specific mention was made of Holloway, no admission that he had been deliberately broken by his own command, no accountability offered to his surviving family members who learned from newspaper articles that their father had not died from simple combat stress but from an experiment that had used him as a laboratory animal. Yet even with the documentary evidence, even with Chen's notes and the official acknowledgement, the deeper mystery remained unresolved. The Phantom transmissions had been real, documented by multiple witnesses across multiple locations, experienced by operators who had no connection to the original experiment and no knowledge that it had occurred. If Webb's recorded voices had been destroyed, if the equipment had been dismantled, then what had those radio operators been hearing in the months and years after Operation Silent Echo ended? What had persisted on those frequencies, calling with the voices of the dead, asking for support that could never come? Some researchers, approaching the question from a psychological perspective, suggested that the phenomenon represented a form of mass hysteria, where knowledge of the original experiment spread informally through military communities and created an expectation that influenced perception. Radio operators, stressed and isolated, heard what they expected to hear, filling static with voices that their traumatized minds recognized. This explanation was neat, rational, and completely failed to account for reports from operators who had no knowledge of the experiment, who had never served in Korea, who encountered the Phantom transmissions years after any information about Operation Silent Echo could have reached them. Other researchers, more willing to entertain unconventional theories, proposed that the recordings had created what they termed psychoacoustic echoes, residual patterns in electromagnetic spectrum that could persist under specific conditions and be detected by sensitive equipment or particularly attuned human perception. This explanation ventured into territory that made even open-minded scientists uncomfortable, suggesting mechanisms that bordered on the paranormal, but it had the advantage of attempting to account for the persistence and geographic spread of the phenomenon. If sounds could leave impressions in the medium through which they traveled, if human voices could somehow imprint themselves on radio frequencies through intensity of emotion or repetition, then perhaps what operators were hearing was not enemy propaganda or equipment malfunction but genuine echoes of transmissions that had been designed to haunt. The truth, if there is such a thing as truth in matters like this, probably lies somewhere between these explanations, in the gray space where psychology and physics overlap and neither discipline quite understands what is happening. What is certain is that Operation Silent Echo succeeded in creating something that outlasted its intended parameters, something that could not be controlled or contained or shut down when the experiment ended. Webb had wanted to weaponize grief, to turn the voices of the dead into instruments of psychological warfare, and in doing so he created a resonance that continued long after the original transmissions stopped. Whether that resonance was technological or psychological, whether it existed in radio equipment or in the minds of those who listened, became a distinction without meaning because the effect was the same. Soldiers continued to hear their dead comrades calling, continued to respond, continued to carry the weight of voices that should have fallen silent. James Holloway's story became emblematic of this persistence. In the years following Chen's disclosure, veterans began coming forward with their own accounts of hearing phantom transmissions, and many of them specifically mentioned hearing a voice that matched descriptions of Sergeant Cross. Mountain accent, calm tone, ending transmissions with standing by. Some claimed to have heard Holloway's voice as well, younger and more strained, responding to Cross, carrying on conversations that covered the same ground again and again, an endless loop of call and response that played out on frequencies that should have been empty. These accounts were impossible to verify, relying entirely on personal testimony from men whose mental health and reliability were often questionable, but the consistency of details across multiple independent reports suggested something more than coincidence or fabrication. The phenomenon even acquired a name among radio enthusiasts and paranormal researchers. The Dead Net, a frequency or set of frequencies where the voices of killed soldiers could allegedly still be heard, calling for support, reporting positions, maintaining communication links that death had not severed. The Dead Net became the subject of amateur investigations, late-night listening sessions, and countless hours of recorded static analyzed for any hint of human speech. Most of these efforts produced nothing but noise and the occasional mistaken identification of random interference as coherent language, but a small percentage of recordings did capture something. Voices that spoke with military precision, using call signs and tactical language, referencing battles and locations from the Korean War era. Whether these were genuine anomalies or sophisticated hoaxes, whether they represented echoes of Operation Silent Echo or something else entirely, remained a matter of debate and speculation. The military's position on the Dead Net phenomenon was consistent and dismissive. There was no evidence of anomalous radio activity, no documented instances of phantom transmissions beyond those that could be explained by conventional interference and psychological factors, and no basis for claims that voices of deceased personnel could be detected on radio frequencies. This position was technically accurate, in that the military had never conducted a formal investigation that would produce such documentation, but it ignored the accumulated testimony of hundreds of witnesses and the physical evidence of the recordings that had been made. The dismissal was not based on evidence but on institutional necessity, the need to maintain a rational framework where dead soldiers stayed dead and radios transmitted only what was sent to them. For the men who had heard the voices, for the radio operators who had spent night watches listening to empty frequencies filled with familiar words, the military's denial meant nothing. They knew what they had experienced, knew the difference between imagination and perception, and they carried that knowledge with them long after their service ended. Some sought psychiatric help, trying to process the experience through therapy and medication, while others simply accepted it as part of the war, another cost that had never been acknowledged or compensated. A few became obsessed, dedicating years to documenting the phenomenon, collecting testimonies, and arguing for recognition that what they had heard was real and significant. Most of these efforts failed, absorbed into the vast indifference that greets most attempts to hold institutions accountable for actions taken in the name of national security. The last verified report of a Dead Net transmission occurred in 1987, when a ham radio operator in Oregon claimed to have intercepted a brief exchange on a frequency near the band that had been used for Operation Silent Echo. The recording was poor quality, degraded by distance and atmospheric conditions, but audio analysis confirmed the presence of human voices speaking English with what sounded like military terminology. The voices discussed coordinates, mentioned units by designation, and concluded with the phrase "standing by" before fading into static. The recording was submitted to several research organizations, analyzed by audio experts, and ultimately determined to be inconclusive, neither definitively authentic nor provably fabricated. It became the last widely circulated piece of evidence related to the phenomenon, a final ambiguous data point in a story that had never achieved resolution. But the absence of recent reports does not necessarily indicate that the phenomenon has ended, only that fewer people are listening. The radio spectrum has changed dramatically since the Korean War, crowded now with digital signals and encrypted communications and the constant background noise of modern electronic civilization. The frequencies where phantom voices once spoke have been repurposed, absorbed into different uses, and the kind of monitoring that would be necessary to detect anomalous transmissions is no longer conducted by isolated operators sitting alone in bunkers but by automated systems that filter out anything that does not match expected patterns. If the Dead Net still exists, if voices still call on those old channels, they do so in a medium that has become inhospitable to ghosts, where human attention has been replaced by algorithms that recognize nothing except what they have been programmed to hear. Perhaps that is the real conclusion of Operation Silent Echo, the final implication of Webb's experiment. Not that he succeeded in creating a psychological weapon, but that he revealed something about the relationship between communication and consciousness, between technology and memory, that neither he nor his contemporaries fully understood. Radio, at its core, is a medium for transmitting human intention across distance, for projecting voice and meaning through the electromagnetic spectrum. When that projection is weaponized, when it is used to manipulate and deceive and destroy, when it becomes a tool for making the dead speak and the living doubt their own perceptions, perhaps it should not be surprising that the results exceed the parameters of the experiment. Perhaps consciousness itself, especially consciousness under extreme duress, creates impressions in the mediums it uses, leaves traces that persist beyond the moment of transmission. This is speculation, of course, the kind of speculation that serious researchers avoid because it cannot be tested or falsified or proven. But speculation is sometimes all that remains when the documented facts lead only to questions that cannot be answered. when the mystery is not what happened but what continues to happen, what echoes through frequencies that should be silent, what calls with voices that should be forgotten. James Holloway died believing he could make contact with his dead friends, believing that if he just got close enough to where they had fallen he would find them still fighting, still waiting for the support he had failed to provide. He was wrong, of course, in the literal sense. His friends were gone, their bodies buried or burned, their consciousness extinguished by the violence that had claimed them. But in another sense, in the sense that mattered to his broken mind and perhaps to the radio operators who would hear phantom transmissions for decades afterward, maybe he was not entirely wrong. Maybe something did persist, some residue of voice and intention and desperate communication, and maybe that residue found a way to continue calling long after the bodies had fallen silent. The ethical implications of Operation Silent Echo are straightforward and damning. The military took a young soldier who had survived a traumatic combat experience, subjected him to psychological torture disguised as research, drove him to madness and death, and then covered up the entire affair to avoid accountability. There is no ambiguity here, no complex moral calculus that makes the experiment justifiable. It was wrong in conception, wrong in execution, and wrong in its aftermath. The fact that it was done in the context of war, that it was framed as necessary for developing psychological warfare capabilities, that it was authorized by officers who believed they were serving their country's interests, none of this mitigates the fundamental wrongness of using a soldier as a test subject without his knowledge or consent. But beyond the ethical condemnation, beyond the clear case of institutional betrayal, Operation Silent Echo raises questions about the nature of psychological warfare itself, about what happens when we treat human consciousness as a battlefield and human emotion as a vector for attack. The experiment demonstrated that it was possible to manipulate soldiers through auditory trauma, to make them question their perceptions and betray their training and even their sense of self by speaking to them in the voices of their dead. This knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten or unlearned. It exists now as part of the toolkit of modern warfare, a technique that may have been officially discontinued but that certainly continues to inform how military and intelligence services think about psychological operations and trauma-based manipulation. The deeper horror is that Operation Silent Echo was not an aberration but part of a pattern, one experiment among many that explored the limits of what could be done to human minds in the name of national security. The declassified history of Cold War psychological research is full of similar programs. MKUltra, Project Bluebird, Artichoke, a catalog of experiments that treated soldiers, prisoners, and civilians as raw material for studying control and coercion. Operation Silent Echo was distinctive in its specific methodology, its focus on auditory manipulation and the weaponization of grief, but it was entirely consistent with the broader philosophy that drove these programs, the belief that understanding how to break people was a legitimate military objective and that the suffering of individual test subjects was an acceptable cost. What makes Operation Silent Echo particularly disturbing is its intimate cruelty, the way it targeted not just Holloway's mind but his deepest emotional bonds, the connections to his fallen comrades that represented both his trauma and his humanity. Webb understood that grief is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, that the need to honor and remember the dead drives behavior in ways that rational thought cannot override. By giving that grief a voice, by making it audible and present and demanding, he created a torture that was more effective than any physical pain because it attacked the victim's sense of meaning and connection. Holloway did not die from injuries or exhaustion. He died trying to answer a call that could never be answered, trying to save friends who were beyond saving, trying to fulfill a duty that existed only in the manipulated recordings that Webb's team had created. And yet, despite all this analysis, despite the documented facts and the clear chain of cause and effect, the central mystery remains untouched. The experiment ended but the voices continued. The equipment was destroyed but the transmissions persisted. James Holloway died but radio operators continued to hear someone speaking with his cadence and his desperate certainty, calling on frequencies that should have carried nothing but static. This is the part that resists explanation, the part that makes Operation Silent Echo more than just another cautionary tale about military overreach and institutional cruelty. This is the part that suggests Webb succeeded in creating something that exceeded his understanding, a form of communication or persistence or haunting that could not be contained by the destruction of physical equipment or the passage of time. The question is not whether these continued transmissions were real in some objective sense, whether they could be measured and recorded and verified by independent observers. Some were, most were not, and the distinction ultimately does not matter because the effect on those who heard them was identical regardless of their origin. The question is what it means that so many people, across so many years, reported the same essential experience. Hearing voices of the dead on radio frequencies, voices that spoke with military precision and personal recognition, voices that called and called and called with a need that could not be satisfied. Was this mass delusion, shared trauma creating shared hallucination? Was it some quirk of radio propagation and human perception, an acoustic phenomenon that science has not yet explained? Or was it something else, something that makes our comfortable categories of real and unreal, living and dead, start to break down? The truth is that we do not know, and more importantly, we probably cannot know because the phenomenon exists in a space where our tools for understanding fail. Science can explain the psychology of grief and the physics of radio transmission, but it struggles with the question of what happens when those two domains intersect in moments of extreme intensity, when human emotion and technological medium become entangled in ways that neither psychology nor physics quite captures. The materialist assumption is that nothing persists, that dead voices are dead voices and radio carries only what is transmitted into it. But that assumption, comforting as it may be, does not account for the accumulated testimony of witnesses who insist they heard something that should not have existed. Perhaps the most honest answer is that Operation Silent Echo created a form of uncertainty, a zone where the line between manipulation and manifestation became impossible to locate. Webb set out to create artificial hauntings, to make the dead speak through recordings, and in doing so he may have inadvertently created conditions where actual hauntings, or whatever term we use for consciousness persisting beyond its expected boundaries, could occur. Not because of anything supernatural or mystical, but because he focused so much attention, so much emotional intensity, so much technological precision on the act of making dead voices speak that something responded to that focus, something found a channel through the equipment and the frequencies in the traumatized minds of those who listened. This is speculation built on speculation, theory stacked on uncertainty, but it is the only framework that makes sense of the full pattern of what happened. The experiment created Holloway's breakdown, yes, but it did not create the transmissions heard by operators who had no connection to the experiment, did not manufacture the consistency of reports across geography and time, did not explain why the phenomenon seemed to spread rather than dissipate as the original equipment was destroyed and the subjects of the experiment died or moved on. Something happened that exceeded the experiment's parameters, and that something suggests we do not understand as much about consciousness and communication and the persistence of human intention as we believe we do. For the soldiers who heard the dead net, for the radio operators who carried those experiences with them for the rest of their lives, this philosophical uncertainty was not abstract. They knew what they had heard even if they could not explain it. They knew that in the darkest hours of night watches, in the isolation of bunkers and signal posts, the radio sometimes spoke with voices that should not exist. And they knew that those voices were not random, were not generic, but were specific and personal, calling with the authority of men who had died and somehow had not entirely stopped fighting. And perhaps, in the end, that is what makes Operation Silent Echo a story worth preserving and examining, despite its darkness and despite the institutional desire to bury it permanently. Not because it reveals some comfortable truth about American military virtue or the honor of service, but because it reveals the opposite: the willingness of institutions to sacrifice individuals, the ease with which ethical boundaries collapse under the pressure of national security narratives, and the profound arrogance of assuming that human consciousness can be manipulated without consequences that exceed our understanding. Every radio operator who heard the phantom transmissions, every soldier who responded to voices that should not exist, every person who carried the experience forward into their civilian lives, they all became living evidence of what happens when we forget that the mind is not a machine that can be programmed and controlled but a mystery that responds to violence with transformations we cannot predict. James Holloway died trying to answer a call that existed only because his own command had manufactured it, trying to save friends who were beyond saving, trying to fulfill a duty that had been weaponized against him. His death certificate lists hypothermia, his gravestone bears no mention of Operation Silent Echo, and his family never received an explanation for why he walked into the frozen hills searching for voices that had been recorded weeks before he heard them. But his story persists, carried forward by researchers and journalists in the slow work of declassification, and that persistence itself is a kind of transmission, a signal that continues to propagate through time, calling attention to what was done and what may still be happening on frequencies we have stopped monitoring. The radio waves that carried Sergeant Cross's voice in December of 1952 have long since dissipated, scattered into the cosmic background radiation that fills the universe. The equipment that recorded and broadcast those transmissions has been destroyed, the bunkers where Holloway sat and listened have crumbled or been repurposed. The men who designed and executed the experiment have died without facing consequences for what they did. But something remains. Perhaps it is only memory, only the stories told by survivors and the documents preserved by archivists who understood that some truths are too important to bury. Perhaps it is something else, some residue of intention and trauma that found a way to persist beyond the physical medium that first carried it. In the end, we are left with silence and the question of what fills it. We are left with empty frequencies and the reports of those who claim to hear voices in the static. We are left with the knowledge that Operation Silent Echo succeeded in creating exactly what it set out to create. A weapon made of grief, a transmission that could not be stopped, a call that echoes across decades with the voice of men who died believing their comrades would answer. Whether those men achieved some form of persistence beyond death, whether their voices genuinely imprinted on the electromagnetic spectrum, or whether the whole phenomenon was nothing but trauma and suggestion and the desperate human need to believe that the dead still speak, these questions may never be answered definitively. But the fact that we must ask them, the fact that Operation Silent Echo created circumstances where such questions become unavoidable, that alone is testament to the program's success in revealing something fundamental and terrible about the intersection of technology, consciousness, and control. We built machines to carry our voices across impossible distances, and then we used those machines to make the dead speak. We should not be surprised that in doing so we created resonances we cannot fully explain, echoes we cannot silence, transmissions that continue long after we have tried to shut them down. The frequency is still there, allocated now to different uses, crowded with digital signals and encrypted data that would be incomprehensible to the radio operators of 1952. But sometimes, according to reports that continue to surface despite the military's denials, sometimes in the deep hours of night when atmospheric conditions align and the electromagnetic spectrum grows quiet, someone hears a voice calling for artillery support, requesting backup, maintaining position, standing by. The voice speaks with a mountain accent, calm and professional, describing coordinates for a hillside that was overrun 70 years ago. And sometimes, faintly beneath that voice or answering it, there is another voice, younger and more strained, promising that help is coming, promising that no one will be abandoned, promising to maintain contact no matter what. These voices exist in a space beyond verification, in the contested territory between perception and reality, trauma and truth. They may be nothing but the mind's desperate attempt to find meaning in noise, to hear the dead in the random crackling of empty air. Or they may be something else, some form of persistence that our science has not yet learned to measure, some way that consciousness under extreme duress leaves impressions that outlast the body that generated them. We do not know, and the uncertainty itself is the final legacy of Operation Silent Echo. The knowledge that we opened a channel we cannot close, that we made the dead speak and in doing so may have given them a way to continue speaking, that the voices we weaponized refuse to be silenced even when we destroy the equipment that first transmitted them. Stand by. The transmission continues. Somewhere in the static, someone is still calling. And somewhere, maybe, someone is still listening, still trying to answer, still hoping that this time the voices will finally fall silent and the dead will be allowed to rest. If you've listened this far, you already know too much. The frequency remains open. The voices still call. Subscribe to War Archives Black and remember, every transmission leaves an echo. Some echoes never fade. In the archives of psychological warfare, in the classified files that document what nations do to their own soldiers in the name of security, Operation Silent Echo stands as a reminder that the cruelest weapons are not the ones that destroy bodies but the ones that infiltrate minds. And the most dangerous experiments are not the ones that fail, but the ones that succeed in ways we cannot control, creating consequences that persist long after we have tried to bury them. The dead are not silent. They never were. We just stopped listening. But the radio remembers. The frequency remembers. And on certain nights, when the static clears and the world grows quiet, James Holloway is still there, still calling, still standing by. Waiting for a response that will never come. Waiting for a war that will never end. Waiting in the space between transmission and reception, where voices echo forever and no one can tell the difference between memory and signal, between haunting and communication, between what we created and what we unleashed. This is the archive. This is what happened. This is what may still be happening out there in the dark, on frequencies we no longer monitor, in the silence between transmissions where the dead refuse to surrender and the living cannot escape the voices that call to them across time and static and the unbridgeable distance between what was and what remains. Standing by. Always standing by.